Good afternoon, everybody. It's Wednesday. It is the 16th of December, and today we have a friend and guest speaker, Sebern Fisher. Sebern's quite well known for her book and her work in dealing with trauma and the use of neurofeedback. Today is sort of not a formal presentation day, as we've sort of noted. This is sort of a have some time just to ask questions and have more of a personal interaction with Sebern. So we're going to start off with as we're getting people unmuted, and we're going to unmute everybody so we can have this interaction. We're going to start off with a few questions that were submitted by folks ahead of time, some of which could not maybe be here today, and others who just want to make sure their questions got answered. So, Sebern, welcome. This crowd knows your work quite well, and many of those folks out there already have your book. And we're going to be letting you just kind of answer questions as we go. So again, welcome. The first question we have, Sebern, came from a colleague out in California, and she asks, do you ever do neurofeedback for those with trauma without adjunctive therapy, or do you always request concurrent psychotherapy?
Oh, I always do. I always integrate psychotherapy and neurofeedback. The core issue in developmental trauma, we're not talking about PTSD, but developmental trauma is attachment rupture. And that manifests in every possible major system in the brain. So first of all, it's going to be a while before that brain organizes itself. That's important. There's no quick fix here. And the second is that it's a behavioral technology. It has to do with allowing people to have relationships, non-traumatic, not impaired by trauma. And that has to begin somewhere, and that begins in the therapeutic relationship. So, I always recommend. I haven't always been the therapist, although I would say we could have a long conversation about that too. I think that there are a lot of the changes that we see with neurofeedback are subtle. We see them in the sort of in the change in the relationship. We know to look for them. We know to look for instance, how loud the voice is, or possibly the different content in dreams. That people who aren't, that's one of thousands of things we might look for. And people who the therapist is not trained in neurofeedback or to know that you can see those kinds of changes. So they're a trauma therapist, but not with neurofeedback, is going to have a hard time giving you and the patient feedback about what's changing if you're not the primary person.
Right. Yeah, I would 100% agree with you. I have two children I adopted, and they had very, very, very traumatic backgrounds, abuse, neglect. When we adopted them, they were very young. They were 3.5 and 5.5, and they were in therapy for quite some time. If you don't have that sort of thing going on with people who were able to, learn how to build a relationship and trust in a psychotherapeutic relationship, then I don't know what you would do doing neurofeedback. So I certainly agree. The next question is, I'm wondering whether Sebern Fisher would still train low frequencies at FPO2 in clients who already show high delta and or theta at FP1 and FP2.
I wouldn't be dissuaded by high theta or high delta frontally to not do it. It would be much more, FPO2 is much more driven, my decision to use it is much more driven by history. Everything I do in neurofeedback is more informed by history, history of trauma, history around head injury, and anything that I see on the raw EEG, the scrolling EEG, that more than it is on cues. And that's another, we could schedule the year conversations. That's another conversation we could have. But yeah, I mean, if this person is still, if I've gone to places and we've quieted, all this is about for me, this simple principle is, can you, with neurofeedback, quiet fear circuitries and keep them from kindling and taking off on the person and ruining their lives? That's it. And so if I've been able to do that with T3 minus T4 or C4 or PZ or P6 or any number of other possibilities, more research is showing in trauma that we should be focusing on the right temporal parietal area. That keeps showing up and showing up and showing up. But of course, no brains conform to the research. They're research, but they don't conform to it. So we don't know actually that's the area for us to always train. But we see huge amounts of theta and sometimes delta at the temporal lobes in T4, specifically T6 also in trauma. It's just typical. And very often, not always, but very often I'm training people in what we think of as the theta range, just to get things quieter for them. So it's not, in my mind, it's not reinforcing at least bad theta. It's bringing the brain keeps saying, oh, I'm not there yet, I'm not there yet. And the person is reporting they're still frightened. So I bring down the frequency, no negative effects from training too low. And I will often, maybe 50% of the time, get as low as the theta domain when I'm training at even at the temporal lobes. So it doesn't, I haven't been able to parse that. I just do, I'm humble. I'm a humble servant of the brain. I do what the brain asks me to do, and then it tells me whether it likes what I've done.
Okay, well, thank you very much. The next question this person had was, in your book, you mentioned training for super short amounts of times at FPO2. What is the longest time you would train there?
That's completely a tolerance question. When I am beginning with FPO2, I don't typically go more than 3 minutes. Part of the difficulty, and it might be part of the first question, is if there's a history of seizure, I don't do FPO2. And that might or might not manifest itself as, a lot of slow wave in the frontal lobe. And may or may not. It's really salient because we don't know. But so what I'm trying to be sure of is that since if brains are going to kindle, and kindling is a major issue in these brains. They're like seizures, right? They have little events build into huge events, And so what you're trying, and the part of the brain that kindles the most readily is the amygdala. And what we think we're getting in FPO2 is the quieting of the amygdala. So, but sometimes we get the excitation of the amygdala, exactly the same frequency or lower or higher, whatever it has been, but this can't be tolerated and you could set off an event, and I don't want to set off an event. So I go in gently, and I don't use FPO2 at the beginning. I use FPO2 to see if I haven't quieted fear, that's another place to go. But I will already have an idea of the tenor of this brain, of what frequencies it does best at, and what's a protocol that I can go to stabilize an effect that I might have set off at FPO2.
Okay.
FPO2 is not a bliss site. People tell me it's funny when you introduced that question, you said, and somebody asking you for your book, and I always feel a slight bracing. Oh God, what have I said? It's like, and sometimes I'm completely quoted out of the context. It's right there in the book. And people have come back and said, you know, Sebern says that FPO2 is a bliss state. Well, if you read about FPO2 in my book, you'd know that I didn't say that, right? You would say, you could say, one of my patients reported bliss as a response.
Well,
So that's different.
That's perfect. And that's a beautiful lead into the third question this person had. And after this one, we're just going to take it to the group here and let other people ask questions. So the last question this person submitted was, has anything changed in your thinking about training people with developmental trauma since you wrote the book?
I have introduced, and I'm interested in training at the back of the head. And there's some of that in the book, but I was just coming to that place where training at the Indian Ridge could be a very useful spot. I was starting to get the neuroscience that would indicate that neuroscience was starting to come on board. And I have become interested in 4-channel coherence training, since the answer should be in coherence in the brain. But I'm not, so far, I'm not seeing the results that I would like to see. So I guess the right answer to that is that I am always looking for new ways that I can help traumatized people. And so I stayed very open. One of the things that actually did happen was very shortly after the book is in the hands of the publisher, beyond my reach, I have 2 people that arrive, and it's very clear, just phenomenologically, that they can't train on the right. It just makes them feel terrible, and they still got a lot of trauma history. One of them was some child who was entered 1st grade or 3rd day of 1st grade at the school right next to 9/11. So, and they both needed left side training low. So the principles of my book, which are to really, follow the lead of the brain, haven't changed, but it takes me to places that I didn't explore in the book. It can take me there, and I'm very open to that and to trying to understand how that goes. And all of us should be. We all should be involved in this. Figuring out origin stories of protocols, seeing how they help our patients, if those help, if they don't help, why they don't help, and making hypotheses, and then seeing if we can either get our colleagues to try this particular approach. That's what happened with the Indian Ridge. And there's a lot of data coming in on the Indian Ridge that I could never have gotten on my own. So, so I'm always looking for new approaches. One person wrote on our website that he was training the Indian Ridge and looking at, he's training the Indian Ridge, I think at 0.5 hertz, and he was looking at at FPO2, and FPO2 would come in sync with the Indian Ridge. And that's not in the literature anywhere. Or somebody else wrote me and said, "Oh, I've done this all wrong. I put FPO2 instead of putting FPO2, I put an FPO1, and the person has just felt great. And should I undo this?" I mean, they didn't say that, but that was the tenor. I said, "Oh, no, you've discovered something. Wait, but it may not apply as widely as FPO2. It may turn out to apply more widely. We don't know. There's not a good reason I can think of why FPO1 would be a better site for trauma than FPO2, but it could turn out to be. Then I'd have to figure out the reason. We all do."
Okay, well, thank you again for answering those few questions. Folks, the floor is open.
Rob?
Yes.
Before we open it, I want to have a brief discussion with Sebern about protocols, because people are saying things like, well, should I train FPO2 or T4P4? And they're thinking like monopolar, sometimes just bipolar, and they aren't realizing that Sebern has a method which is not, used by everybody. She uses certain kinds of filter settings and so forth. And I always recommend that if you want to do what she's doing, you really need to take her workshop to learn how she's doing it. Would you agree with that, Sebern, at all? Or
Well, yeah. I mean, the problem, the more and more, the good news is more and more people are doing neurofeedback, and the bad news is that more and more people are doing neurofeedback. And there's no unifying principle. There's no unified field theory of the brain. I am a psychotherapist. I come into this through the route of psychotherapy. So I am the language of arousal and the understanding of the brain as resonating in a certain state of neuronal arousal. That makes sense to me. And it fits with everything that I already think about, where the problems are, where the affective realm, the affective domain of the brain is where our problems lie. And that, as I said earlier, before we officially started, everything that I do has to do with quieting fear. And so I'm following the neuroscience. And I'm quieting arousal through frequency and sight. And as I was saying also before we officially got on, the right temporal parietal area is showing up in all the literature to be a problem area for people with developmental trauma, as is the default mode network, which is what I've got up here on the screen. And I can say a few words about this that are that fit in with the way that I'm thinking. And more so than I have in the book, I think I've become more focused on this.
yeah, why don't you talk about your I know you wanted to share this with us.
Yeah, I do. And there are only 3 slides, and then we can talk the rest of the time.
Yeah.
Free. So this is a slide. This is a slide of some of 16 people, a conglomerate slide showing the results of 16 fMRIs with people without impact of childhood trauma. They were unexposed. And so what you're seeing here is in the back of the, can you see my arrow? Does that show up? Okay, so in the back of the head, you see this is the past, this is the autobiographical memory, this is the sense of self in time and space. This is very important, right? And that's full of blood flow and full of sunshine. Okay, and the front part here is the narrative part of the biography. So this is after somebody, they've all been in the scanner for a while. They've been doing some presumably mental math, some task, and now their brain is off task. And they haven't been told that that's what their researchers are looking for, is what their brain looks like off task. But this is what our brains typically would look like off task. What's happened here is that the person who's now no longer having to do mental math has shifted from the executive network to what's called the default mode network. And this is, or the resting state network. There's just not a lot of rest here. What's happening is that the person is thinking about themselves, reflecting on their lives, the date they're going to have tonight, or the grocery shopping, whatever. But there's something that's involved with self and other that's going on in this network. And this has been called now, it's also called the self-other network. This whole network is what researchers look at with psychedelics as well, because this network will go down in meditators who drop out of a sense of self. But wait, that's, again, a whole nother topic. So let's look. So this is a healthy resting state or default mode network. The person is engaged in thinking about themselves, and there's a full self-representation in this network in the brain. And this is what it looks like in those who have had severe developmental trauma. The differences are staggering. So this is the person you are theoretically doing, in that answer to the earlier question, that you are doing therapy with, right? This is the argument for why you have to get the brain, go directly to the brain, because there's no self-other. One of my patients, the person who was interviewed by Bessel, said in the interview, some parts shown, sometimes not, says in that interview that she knew I cared about her, that I was on her side, but in a way she didn't know I existed at all. And she didn't know she existed either. And that was the condition of our talk therapy. Impossible. This slide is very important for you all to know about, and this work that she's doing, because it is validating at every turn. Let me show you the next one. The top of this slide is the neurofeedback. These are with patients with dissociative problems, and I think there are 23 in the set. 23 patients that all have dissociative disorders. And what you see at the beginning is the connectivity. Look at this red line over here on my. God, it's impossible, but it's on my left. This red line is the most important to pay attention to, the green too, but the red. You can see that red dot is the periaqueductal gray. This is the threat detecting system in the human brain, and this is on fire status. It's like staticus, status epilepticus. This is always on. This is in a hyper state of vigilance. And it is connected, hyper connected to the amygdala. No prefrontal action at all. This is a person who's absolutely in threat mode. 100% of the people that Ruth scanned who had these histories of dissociation showed this network. 100%. After one session of neurofeedback, this was alpha down neurofeedback, which he's writing a lot about. Alpha down neurofeedback, the connectivity pattern changed in 80% of the patients. This wouldn't stay this way. This would be a miracle. But what gets established is you lose this connectivity of this very primitive part of the brain being connected to the amygdala, and you go to the amygdala being connected to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex now activating control over the amygdala. If people understood the importance of this slide, it would be at least on the front page of the Science Times, if not in the New York Times itself. And this is the third. So this is very recent. This is probably in the last 3 months. This is this year. This is showing the default mode network in controls and those with developmental trauma. And the controls are on my left. And what you're seeing is these are subliminal threat messages that are being shown. A bear, I think it is, growling, but it's a subliminal, but it's shown so quickly that they don't even know what it is. And what shows up in the controls is at rest, no trauma trigger, no stim that is setting them off, is that healthy default mode network that we looked at before. If you look down, and the same lack of default mode network in those with developmental trauma. They don't have a sense of self and other. They don't have a past, a present, and a future. This is all set up in the brain. So then you go to, then they introduce the growling bear image, and all of the default mode network at rest, the where you're thinking about yourself and your, and what you're going to do that day, all of that goes away, and the focus of the brain is on threat. This is in normals, quote normal, unaffected by trauma. Those affected by trauma, look what happens. You get a semblance of a default mode network coming online, only under the conditions of threat. This is an astounding finding, particularly for those of us who are working with people called borderline, who keep putting themselves at risk or constantly re-engaging in threatening behaviors, putting themselves in some threat. And now it looks like it has, at least, if not meaning to the person, it certainly has meaning to their brains, because from this you could say that the only time they have a sense of self is under these conditions. So what we think of as repetition compulsion and the very behaviors that are so difficult for therapists to deal with have a rationale of they organize something in the sense of self. Some sense of agency comes online. It's powerful stuff, right? So I wanted to show those to you. That's all I have is in lecture form, but I just wanted, because this is so important, and I think it's this network ultimately that we, when we're working with people who have been traumatized, or there's been a major disruption in attachment, which is always there in trauma, but then you have brutalization on top of that, or war, or death, or all the other awful things that happen to children. We see what we have, the job we have in front of us, and how anybody could deny that we need to engage the brain in this after you look at these almost like photos. Would be beyond me, but that no one sees them. I want to make sure you did. So there you go.
That's great. It's great. So Rob, shall we get some questions in here?
Yeah, let's go ahead and start.
I have a quick question.
Rodney, go ahead.
Yeah, Sebern, can something like this develop as early as infancy in the first 2 years of life, where there's significant emotional neglect from the parent?
Yes. Neglect may be a bigger issue, actually, than assault, right? Because that's really the other realm of trauma that we think about. Emotional abuse or emotional assault, what they have found, so yes, I mean, neglect is huge. And what they have found is Rob Coben's research actually on 50 subjects in the ages 17 to 70, I think, 76. In those patients, it was undiscernible in the brain whether the problem was neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse. And what he could see, they all had equally bad effects.
So I have a question of I see these pictures of a mom that's bottle feeding or breastfeeding their baby while they're looking at their phone. Can that develop into emotional neglect and trauma?
I don't know. It depends on what she does the rest of the time, but it does concern me. I see this a lot, I see what looks evidently more like attachment to the phone than to the baby. And I don't, and I don't know whether that would show up clinically, in the generation coming on now, being, now, I guess, the phones have been a major
One of the
item.
things you have to do, sorry, we weren't muted.
No,
So
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, it's
Go
just somebody, that was somebody who failed to mute themselves. That's all.
Oh.
Go ahead.
No, I have nothing. I share the same concern. I don't know what the science will show, but I think there's reason to be concerned.
I share in that concern. Thank you very much. Dealing with people with complex PTSD is what I'm thinking about.
In what regard, though?
Oh, I just thinking about their possible history. One of them is a veteran that had a sexual encounter with a therapist after she had gone through abuse while she was in the service. But given her history, she goes back to being molested when she was very early age at 3, and what she describes is a family where there was a very large family, but they were very cold, and she was the youngest, and I got the impression that she was probably neglected, as her own recounting kind of alludes to, when she was very young, possibly even as an infant, which compounds it and
And you'll
contributes.
pick that up often in the, in the transference too, where, neglect is the big issue. Interestingly, just to keep you on your toes in the neurofeedback realm, the reason that I went to the Indian Ridge to begin with was because I read an article in a chapter in Ruth Lanish's first book on childhood trauma, hidden epidemic, I think. Anyways, it's a collected work, and it was a paper by Marty Teicher and Carl Anderson. And what they had wanted to see if you could sort out the difference between Marty wanted to see what blood flow differences there may or may not be, or changes in the cerebellum. Sent it on to Carl Anderson, who's a cerebellum expert, and he was able to image in some way the blood flow in the vermis, the central structure of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum's down here, and the central structure is really just the same, about the same place in the central. It's right down along here. And this is now very hot in neuroscience research, is what's going on in the cerebellum. It's been ignored for all of my history in neurofeedback. The cerebellum was sort of shunted out of the way, and then a lot of other research it was too. If the cerebellum in the women with histories of sexual abuse as children, they will have excess, abnormally high levels of blood flow in the cerebellar vermis. So when I went to, I said, okay, so can I affect that? Can I go to where the injury is? So that's why I went to the Indian Ridge. It was as close as I could get. That was still on the cerebrum, right? That would reach the cerebellar vermis. And of course, it's also right, within eyesight anyway. I mean, the central structures. These are all central structures. The amygdala is a central structure, meaning close into the brain. The PAG is. So maybe this part of the brain we need to be paying more attention to, and that's one of the things that it's been more since I wrote the book, more attention to this area. And I have no way of knowing. I would have had to work with Carl to know whether we just change this indicator of sexual trauma of the blood flow in the vermis. But it's the reason that I went to the Indian Ridge to begin with, to see if I could help, if that would help quiet things in a way that central training or temporal lobe training didn't.
Thank you for that explanation.
You're so welcome.
Sebern, a couple of questions on the Indian Ridge. This is Judy, and it's really wonderful to have you here today. I'm like almost just have so many good things to say. I'll just ask my questions instead. Do you on the Indian Ridge? Do you have limitations, like I've only been doing it for 3 or 4 minutes. So I wanted to know time frame on that, and also age grouping. When how young do you do Indian Ridge training with
I'm
kids?
just going to, Judy, I'm just going to report from the field because I only work with adults. And people are now using this widely with ADHD. You know, we have to remember that none of these diagnoses are real either, right? That's a whole topic. So it's arousal, and it just seems to help quiet a certain body aspect of arousal to train at the Indian Ridge. So irrespective of whether there's been sexual abuse, that's just what brought me there. That's the origin story. So with a person who has sexual abuse as a child, I might go there soon. In terms of time, I think most people are finding 3 to 6 minutes is absolutely enough. And in general, I think, you know, when I started in this field, the standard was 30 minutes of training. And some people may still adhere to that. My sense is that most training, the biggest problem that we may have with neurofeedback is overtraining. So I think we can get an awful lot done before the brain gets tired of us. And that's usually 9 to 12 minutes at almost any site. But these sensitive sites like FP01 and Indian Ridge, which seem to really hone in on these central structures, maybe just because they're right in line with each other, that I do very little. And as I said, the not research, but the clinical conversations are coming back from people very young who are using, 5, 6, you know. One is a set of twins that somebody is working with, and she was able to work very well with one, and the other didn't calm down at all until she introduced the Indian Ridge. We have to, we have to make something of that, but I don't know exactly what to make of it.
Just to be clear, Sebern, when you talk about overtraining, you were talking about a time frame. So like, say 10 or 12 minutes per session. But from the standpoint of others who would wonder the frequency of training, say per week or whatever, what would your range be in that realm?
I think it's ideal to do twice a week.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that I have a volatile brain, and that's really true. It's because of my volatility in my brain, right? I only know what a training has done for me or to me, as the case may be. This is now, I've been doing this for a long time, so I have a much better sense of it, but was after 2 sleeps. So the first night I wouldn't know. It was just the brain trying to process something different that was happening, and that could throw me in any possible direction. The second night, I started to get a sense of what this training had actually meant. And by the third day, I had an idea. I think you still don't really know, but you have an idea of what the brain could do. So my optimal schedule was a Monday, Thursday, or Tuesday, Friday for people.
Thank you. Judy, go ahead. I know you had more questions.
I was going to ask about some of the rationale. On the Indian Ridge, training Theta Up is pretty standard. Am I correct on that? And why?
Well, you remember I was talking about being humble? It's like, why? I don't know. Because people get wildly aroused if you train higher.
Right.
And I don't think it's because I think literally that frequency range of 2 to 5, that could be more delta. That is often 2 to 5, almost always below 4 to 7. Not always, but almost always. We don't know. I don't know what the rules are. I don't know what, I don't know why it's that low at FPO2 either, but it almost always is. So, you find out and win the Nobel Prize.
I know it's working on my people, so that's
Yeah,
what's really thrilling. And we hardly ever train those areas. I mean, we hardly ever train those frequencies up. So it is, you know, something I have to just understand a little bit more. That's
well, it's just what quiets the brain. And then, you know, you have to insert the theory. But if you say to yourself, it's training theta up, it's going to confuse the picture, you know, because we don't, you know, that's a name of a range. If you say this is what it takes to quiet the brain at that, it's a little at that site and at the site frontally, and that's empirical. I mean, you can argue the empiricism of it, but that's where we get so much trouble in this field. As I say, there's no good reason. There's also excess theta there already. Why would you train more theta? That's absolutely reductionist in terms of the brain, right? It's to completely reductionist. Like, so it's just to say, what did it what calms this brain, or what calms the most brains the most amount of the time? And that's what we have to go by. And we don't have, as I said at the beginning, we don't have a unified field theory about the most complex signaling system in the known to the universe. This is a quantum universe inside your skull and inside mine, and I bet you they don't operate on the same rules. I bet you and I train very differently, right?
yeah.
So we have to accommodate that in our thinking about neurofeedback.
Hi, it's Honey. I'm curious, do you train only eyes closed, or do you sometimes do eyes open? And do you also train faster brain waves down at the same time?
In terms of FPO2?
The Indian, or FPO, or both.
Yeah, FPO2, I've always trained eyes closed for a couple of reasons. One is that there's paste very close to the eye, right? And so better to have the eyes closed if possible. Some people, they'll get more aroused with their eyes closed, so it's not, doesn't help. And the other is to have people, when we close our eyes, we begin to make slower waveforms in our brain, and we're trying to get everything to get quieter. So I haven't made that so discrete in Indian Ridge. I haven't thought about it the same way. So you could see what your folks or you feel when you train Indian Ridge eyes open and eyes closed, and put it into the conversation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And then what about like beta or high beta? Are you training any of that down?
I'm always inhibiting high beta. It's always it's a background inhibit always. So 22 to 36, I'm always inhibiting. But beta itself, I'm not. I'm inhibiting. If anything, I'm inhibiting slow wave when I'm training, even in these very slow, very low frequencies. So I keep a 1 to 6 inhibit on every traumatized brain. And the reason that I do that, even though these nest, right, the reward and the inhibit, well, the reward can often nest inside the inhibit, is because I'm trying to make good, steady, you know, we always make every frequency all the time. The problem isn't that. It's like in your sleep, you're making much more delta. Or if you've had a stroke, you're making much more delta, right? In your sleep, it's fine, but in a stroke, you have to recover from making more delta. So, but we're always making some delta all the time. So what I want to do is make this brain not to take a trajectory and become paroxysmal, become, you know, dysregulated. And the paroxysmal activity, or whatever it is that goes on in these brains that looks so much like a seizure, always happens, not always, vast majority of the time happens in between 1 to 6 hertz. So I'm just saying, stay steady here. Don't make any big bursts of slow wave. Stay steady and quiet down. And the brain sorts that out. It sorts out signal from noise all the time. It signals out, it figures out how to do both at the same time. To both make more and to contain to respond to the reward and to respond to the inhibit. It can do that at the same time.
That's amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi,
Sebern,
students.
could you-
No, we've got
Sebern?
so many questions.
Sebern, I was wondering, can you speak to when you do, say, a C4, P4 location, where are you putting the reference, and are you using a linked ears? Do you do linked ears in that case?
C4, P4 would have the reference is in that, right? What you're saying is that the active site, there's the active site and the reference, they're both active. You're training the relationship between two active sites. One is at C4 and one is at P4. So then the ground is the, can be either ear.
Okay, so would it be a linked ears? Would you do like a linked ears?
No, I don't, you know, the time that's called for the linked ear to date, I mean, all of this is going to matter. So the question is a good one. But the only time that I've heard an argument pro or con linked ears is with cues. And we're not talking about cues at all.
Okay, so you have a clip on each ear, and then you have the two actives,
Right.
C4.
I only have a clip on one ear. I only need one ground. Right, you just have to ground from one place.
Right, right. Okay, so one's a ground, one's a reference, and then the two on the head.
Yeah, and the reference, and you see you've got 3 electrodes, right? So C4 is one of them, P4 is the other, and you have the ground.
On the ear.
On the ear, yeah. So the C4 and the P4, both active, they're now being trained in relationship to each other. So you don't need any ear in that process. You don't need a right ear. There's no further reference.
Okay.
Yeah, Lauren, that's called a bipolar montage. It's been used for decades and decades in neurofeedback. And if you have any questions, you can just contact us and we'll walk you through how to set it up.
Okay.
So, Rob, can I jump in? Because I know we're going to be fighting the clock soon.
Go,
So,
Vic,
Sebern, thank you so much for giving us this time. You know, I've heard you at Lawson's conferences, and I'm sure this question of unifying theory must have come up before, because us Jungians like to think we have some semblance of a unifying hypothesis that's based on the yin-yang balance, just the same as the compensatory function in the brain in any organism seeks equilibrium, right? That scientific principle. I know you based heavily in science, so I know you don't like going out too theoretical. I'm assuming, but I haven't heard you say clearly what your opinion of Jung's hypothesis is, or who's been most influential in your psychodynamic underlying physical approach. Like, I just wanted to say, in my therapy, Erickson is critical, the developmental, you know, his developmental steps.
Right.
So we're always dealing with adjustment issues.
Right.
And Winnicott's holding environment and Cohat's sense of self. So
Right.
if we're working on the hypothesis of the functional self with low arousal, that's able to find some sort of optimal balance. You know, I'm reminded Hans Selye speaks about finding the optimum level of stress. So for some people who have a hereditary volatile brain, we like to think that it is possible to have a high enough level of stress without the arousal impairing our capacity to be logical. but more important than logical when you're doing the alpha theta training, to my mind, is the capacity to utilize the serotonin in the gut and not just focus on the higher brain, but the whole body brain. So I want to say how much I appreciate your contribution to the field and working with people in the medical profession who have a different philosophical approach, or more put differently, our challenge to be clinicians in a world that is so difficult, right? Our healthcare system is so difficult to stay in the healthcare system and find a contribution, because I remember your work came out of working with children. I just remember you talking about, as a social worker, those difficult cases we see in the children's homes all around the world, where children are basically victims of the system. So that brings me back to, in my circular thinking, to the complex of the scapegoat, right? I see that as an archetypal complex that drives so much pathology that so few of us understand just how this archetype of the scapegoat works. And
Right.
and maybe your research is close to getting a picture of just what happens when the scapegoat complex comes in, because it is so complex, right? So that makes me feel like, yeah, you're onto something when you say there's no unifying theory, because we're never going to get a clear picture of the scapegoat complex on an MRI or any map.
Exactly. We're never going to get an fMRI of a theory, right? We have to build our theory from our practice and from our, when I was thinking about, what would theorists of the self say with this? What if they were to look at this, look at what this network is? It's not in any of the theory. It was way before that. Almost all psychological theory comes before this. And even more, I was talking to a consciousness researcher, or a psychotherapy researcher actually, and he couldn't take this in. But I said, how is it that anyone can understand the nature of consciousness if they haven't seen or don't know that the brain can change its whole relationship to itself? It can, if it gets reflected to itself. Right? That's not in any theory. That's theory that's going to come up and around through the work that we're doing. Right? What does it mean that this brain at the bottom can become this brain at the top? How does that work at the level of the brain? And so that, otherwise everything else you said is fascinating and I think important, but way beyond the scope of maybe even of what I could respond to. But it's definitely one. It's definitely our time is just about up. So I want to thank you for the quality of your mind. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Stephen.
All right, well,
Stephen,
Sebern, we're at the
yeah.
top of the hour here, and if anybody doesn't have but a quick question, I think we'll go ahead and wind this down.
Robert, can I throw one more in?
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Sebern, I've been doing a lot of alpha down, and I'm wondering what you do with combining other protocols with alpha down. Do you do the alpha down once a week, but then still do business as usual in other sessions later in the same week? What do you do with that?
I haven't had actually a very good responder yet to alpha theta. I mean to alpha down, but I think somewhere it's been profound. So but I have a small practice now. I'm writing another book, and I'm in COVID like everybody else is, and my practice is pretty small. So what I do, I can just say what other people have done. Ruth Lanius, who's the author of that protocol, what she does is, because there can be a rough ride after this, she tends to ride that out with therapy. And she can do one of these sessions once a month, right? But
Yeah.
really that Ruth is having to shift her whole perspective from psychotherapy to neurofeedback. We're watching somebody in her own process trying to figure out what are the implications for what she's finding for her own practice and her own thinking. What other people have done is to add into, to if it's gotten rough, if it's rough without, so when I think of rough, is it rough? Is it gratuitously rough? Or is there something here that we can only get to in the waves, in the roughness, right? The person that had the terrible FPO2 response that I write about in my book, she had childhood memory that had been lost to her for eight years of her childhood was gone. And it all came back with 1 minute of training at FPO2. Well, was that gratuitous, the stuff that she and I had to deal with? No, it had to be dealt with, I think. I don't think that brain was going to be corrected without its history being known. And that's part of the argument as well for combining this with psychotherapy. So, but that being said, it's gratuitous. It's the same old, nothing new is coming up. It's just terror. I will go to protocols that I've used successfully before or should be successful and use those in the second session or maybe many sessions till the brain calms down again, because gratuitous suffering is that, it's gratuitous. There's nothing to be said for it. And that's when I will always train. That's an important principle. And a good question.
That's well said, Sebern, and a good point to close. I think that's a really, you could spend a whole day on that topic. It's great.
Well, as always, I say this, I'm always happy to come back.
Great. Well, we look forward to it.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the very bright questions. Okay.
Okay. Very much appreciated. Okay, everybody. Have a great day. A good rest of your week. We will see you Friday. Friday the focus will be on Q&A for the presentations that were done on home and remote and telehealth training. So we'll see you Friday. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks again, Sebern.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.